One hill, one blunder, and one river of blood that changed the Union forever. The winter wind off the Rappahannock cut like a knife. The once peaceful town of Fredericksburg, Virginia, sat shivering under gray skies, its church steeples half hidden in smoke. Burnside's Grand Army, over 120,000 Union soldiers, had crossed from the north believing the path to Richmond was open. They were wrong. A Confederate private later wrote, "We could see the blue masses forming across the river. They looked like an ocean about to break for the South." This battle was more than defense. It was survival. For the North, it was supposed to be redemption after the chaos of Antietam. General Ambrose Burnside had taken command only weeks earlier. Washington demanded action. His plan looked sound on paper. Rush to Fredericksburg, cross the Rappahannock, and race for Richmond before Lee could stop him. But delays strangled the plan. Pontoon bridges didn't arrive. Fog and rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Every wasted hour let Robert E. Lee dig deeper into the hills south of town, especially Marye's Heights, the ridge that would soon be baptized in blood. Confederate General James Longstreet positioned his artillery with almost surgical precision. He later recalled, "It was the best ground for defense I ever saw." Burnside, still confident, believed overwhelming numbers could crush even perfect defenses. Union engineers tried to throw pontoon bridges across the Rappahannock at dawn. Confederate sharpshooters hidden in the town's buildings picked them off one by one, the air filled with the pop of rifles and the screams of dying men. Colonel Norman Hall remembered, "The river seemed to boil under the fire." Frustrated, Burnside ordered his artillery to level the town. Cannon after cannon roared, turning Fredericksburg into a smoking ruin. Civilians fled into cellars. One Confederate described the bombardment as hell bursting loose upon earth. By nightfall, the Bluecoats finally crossed. They looted wine cellars, raided homes, and staggered drunkenly through the streets. It was the Union Army's lowest moment. The Confederates waited patiently on the heights. Lee's defensive line stretched 4 miles. In front of Marye's Heights, a stone wall bordered a sunken road. Longstreet packed his infantry behind it, men from South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, roughly 7,000 riflemen with 50 cannon on the slopes above. When one officer asked how they'd handle an assault, Longstreet smiled grimly. "We will kill them in heaps." Burnside's subordinates begged him to reconsider. He refused. The plan was simple: frontal assault. He would hammer Lee until the Confederate line broke. Morning dawned cold and clear. Frost glistened on the fields as Union troops formed ranks below the town. At 11 a.m., the 1st Brigade advanced. The men moved slowly across open ground, shoulder to shoulder, flags snapping. From the Confederate wall came a flash and a rolling crash, volley fire so intense it shredded whole ranks. One Union soldier remembered, "The air was alive with bullets. The very ground seemed to hiss." Every advance ended the same way. Men falling by the hundreds, officers waving swords in vain, drums falling silent. By mid-afternoon, Burnside had thrown division after division into the same killing field. The dead carpeted the slope in blue. Confederates behind the wall barely lifted their heads to fire. They could shoot by sound alone. Private Alexander Hunter of the 17th Virginia later said, "We fired until the barrels burned our hands." At one point, the Union Irish Brigade was ordered to attack. They marched beneath green flags, knowing full well it was suicide. A Confederate watching them was moved to tears. They came as steady as English veterans, never flinching, never wavering. One Southern colonel ordered his men to hold fire until the Irish were within 50 yards. Then the ridge exploded. In minutes, nearly half the brigade lay bleeding in the frozen field. That was only the afternoon. Burnside would send more, and more, until daylight died and the Rappahannock glowed red in the sunset. On December 15th, Burnside finally ordered retreat. Rain turned the roads to sludge as the broken blue columns stumbled back across the pontoon bridges. Confederate soldiers watched silently from the heights, unwilling to cheer. The field below was a sea of corpses, blue and gray tangled together, frozen in death. A Confederate diarist recorded, "We buried them until our arms gave out, and still the earth seemed full of Yankees." In Washington, the shock was immediate. Newspapers howled for Burnside's removal. Lincoln, pale and weary, whispered to a colleague, "If there is a worse place than hell, I am in it." Fredericksburg became a symbol of everything wrong with the Union war effort. Politics over planning, pride over patience, orders over common sense. Yet it also gave birth to legends. The Irish Brigade, the gallantry of both sides, and the bitter truth that courage alone cannot win a war. Years later, a Union veteran stood on Marye's Heights and said quietly, "We left our youth on that hill. What the war took from us, no peace could ever give back." And then the Irish Brigade stepped forward into legend. Fredericksburg wasn't just a lost battle, it was a case study in how leadership can destroy bravery. The Union soldiers who died at the base of Marye's Heights didn't fall because they lacked courage. They fell because their commander believed numbers could overcome nature, and arrogance could overcome artillery. Burnside was never meant to be a battlefield genius. Even his own officers admitted he'd only accepted command out of duty, not ambition. But in December 1862, he stood at the head of the largest army ever assembled in North America. And he hesitated. Every hour he delayed crossing the Rappahannock, Lee's defenses grew deadlier. By the time Burnside moved, the Confederates had transformed Marye's Heights into a fortress. Longstreet's men dug in behind the stone wall, and Lee's artillery commanded every approach. Union intelligence reports underestimated the position completely, claiming it was no stronger than usual terrain. That false confidence killed thousands. A Confederate artilleryman later described the advantage. "We could rake the whole plain. The Yankees had to march over open ground as bare as a floor. It was target practice, that terrain, the slope, the field, the wall, turned one general's ambition into a national tragedy." The failure of communication. Another reason the Union collapsed at Fredericksburg was confusion in the chain of command. Burnside divided his army into grand divisions, a new structure meant to improve control. In reality, it made coordination nearly impossible. When Burnside ordered attacks on the Confederate left, Franklin's division misunderstood the scope of the assault. Instead of unleashing 50,000 men, only 8,000 advanced. The attack actually broke through a weak point in Jackson's line, but no reinforcements came. What might have been a breakthrough turned into another wasted chance. Meanwhile, Sumner's corps on the right attacked Marye's Heights without artillery support. Burnside's headquarters was a mile away. Messages took hours to travel back and forth. By the time new orders arrived, whole divisions were dead. Historian Bruce Catton wrote, "It was a battle fought in echoes and smoke, where the voice of command never reached the men who needed to hear it." Lee's mastery of defense. Fredericksburg showcased Robert E. Lee's genius for defensive warfare. He didn't have to outnumber the Union. He just had to let them come. His army, though smaller, was perfectly positioned. Lee used 3 layers of defense. 1. The Rappahannock River as a natural barrier. 2. Fredericksburg itself, where sharpshooters delayed Union crossings. 3. The Heights, a natural fortress with interlocking fields of fire. He and Longstreet understood a brutal truth. The closer the enemy came, the deadlier the fire. The Union Army, by contrast, advanced with banners flying and drums beating. Visible, predictable, and doomed. When Longstreet later reflected on the battle, he said, "It was slaughter, nothing less. They came, and we shot, and they came again, and still we shot." Lee's brilliance lay not just in positioning, but in restraint. He resisted the temptation to counterattack, preserving his army for future campaigns. His goal was not annihilation, but endurance, to make the North bleed until peace looked cheaper than victory. The psychological impact of Fredericksburg was enormous. For the Union, it shattered faith in leadership. Soldiers who had once marched under the cry, "On to Richmond," now cursed the name Burnside. One private from the 20th Massachusetts wrote home, "We are willing to fight, but not to be murdered by blunders." Desertion rates spiked. Letters from the front dripped with bitterness. The dream of quick victory evaporated in the cold Virginia mud. For the Confederacy, Fredericksburg was proof that Southern will could defeat Northern wealth. Newspapers across Richmond declared, "The God of battles has smiled upon our cause." Yet even in victory, Lee and his men felt no joy. They'd seen too much death to celebrate. A Confederate surgeon remembered, "We did not cheer. We just stood and watched the field. It was as if God himself had turned his face away." The lessons of failure. Fredericksburg became a classroom for future generals. Burnside's catastrophe taught the Union the price of ignoring terrain and logistics. Later commanders like Grant and Sherman learned those lessons well. They would never again charge fortified lines without overwhelming artillery and maneuver. Fredericksburg also showed the North the emotional limits of heroism. Gallantry alone could not win a modern war. The Civil War was becoming industrial, fought with rifled muskets, entrenched positions, and mathematics, not romance. A Union officer summed it up with haunting simplicity. "We charged history itself and lost." In the ruins of Fredericksburg, both sides found a strange sense of respect. Confederate soldiers risked their lives to bring water to the wounded enemy lying in the open. Union survivors, crawling back under cover of night, whispered thanks to the rebels who spared them. One Confederate private, Richard Kirkland of South Carolina, became immortalized as the Angel of Mary's Heights. During the night, he leapt over the wall with canteens, offering water to dying Yankees under heavy fire. When his officers tried to stop him, he said simply, "All I want to do is give them water." Even the enemy held their fire when they saw what he was doing. In that moment, humanity rose above the horror of war. When word reached Washington, despair spread through every corridor. Lincoln walked the halls in silence for hours, clutching reports of the dead. A witness later wrote, "His face was gray and weary. He said little, but his eyes told everything." Burnside offered his resignation. Lincoln hesitated to accept it, but eventually replaced him with General Joseph Hooker. The Army needed new leadership and new hope. The defeat at Fredericksburg would set the stage for the next great test, Chancellorsville, where Lee would again outthink the Union, this time at an even greater cost. Fredericksburg endures not because it was glorious, but because it was tragic. It reminds us that courage is powerless without clarity, and that war rewards patience more than passion. Generals learned, soldiers suffered, and history took note. As one survivor of the Irish Brigade said decades later, standing before the memorial wall, "We marched to die that others might learn how not to die." Fredericksburg was more than a Confederate victory. It was the turning point where both sides began to understand the true price of war.